Good evening and welcome to Scotland at 7. My name is Saoirse Healey. It's just me in the studio today, so I'll be running you through today's top stories from Scotland and abroad. As always, we'll start first with the Ukraine update. Today is day 400. A Moscow court has formally arrested a reporter for the Wall Street Journal in relation to espionage allegations, according to Russian law enforcement agencies. The Moscow court has ordered Gerashkovich should be held in pre-trial custody for nearly 2 months until the 29th of May, according to a court document. Russian forces have had some success in the eastern frontline city of Bakhmut, Ukraine, military officials said on Wednesday evening, adding that their fighters were still holding on in a battle that has lasted several months. Russia's Deputy Foreign Minister Sergei Ryabkov has said Moscow will continue to give the US advance notice about its missile test despite suspending participation in the New START nuclear arms treaty. Alexei Moskalyov, a Russian man who was sentenced to 2 years in prison for discrediting the Russian armed forces and whose daughter was taken into care, has been detained after fleeing house arrest. The UK Ministry of Defence is reporting that Russian authorities are preparing to launch a major recruitment campaign aimed at signing up 400,000 new troops to fight in Ukraine. Ukrainian volunteers who have been evacuating civilians from front lines of the war with Russia say some parents have been hiding their children in basements to prevent them from being taken. While parents have given different reasons, most volunteers have attributed the phenomenon of a combination of poverty and the psychological conditions of families who have been living under bombing for months. MPs from the pro-Russia far-right Freedom Party walked out of the lower house of Austria's parliament on Thursday during a speech by Ukrainian President Volodymyr Zelensky, protesting that it violated Austria's neutrality. China said its military was willing to work together with the Russian military to strengthen strategic communication and coordination. Dmytro Kuleba, Ukraine's foreign minister, said that Russia taking over chairing the UN Security Council on the 1st of April is a bad joke. The US Secretary of State Antony Blinken plans to attend the NATO foreign ministers meeting in Brussels on the 3rd to the 5th of April. Rafael Mariano Grossi, the head of the UN nuclear watchdog, the IAEA, had made a second visit to the Zaporizhzhia nuclear plant in Ukraine on Wednesday amid an escalation in the fighting around it. The Russian Deputy Foreign Minister Sergei Ryabkov said today that Moscow was still talking to the head of the IAEA about the idea of a safety zone around the plant. Russia's Ministry of Defense announced that it begun exercises with the Yars intercontinental ballistic missile system and several thousand troops. Now, today, Hamza Yousaf faced his first FMQs. He not only had to face questions from the opposition, but climate protesters as well. The debut First Minister's questions was disrupted a total of 5 times in the first 15 minutes, leading to the public gallery being cleared. The climate activist group responsible, This Is Rigged, describes itself as a community taking Scottish-specific direct action to demand that the Scottish Government oppose all new oil and gas projects and ensure a just transition for our oil workers. The group has disrupted FMQs a total of 8 times since the 12th of January and has no plans to stop. The group released a video on Instagram after bringing FMQs to a standstill. They said, "New First Minister, same demands. Hamza Yousaf, will you commit to ending all new oil and gas projects, including Rosebank, Jackdaw, Abigail and Peterhead?" In an email to MSPs, Presiding Officer Alison Johnston set out additional new security measures to address the ongoing disruptions which have been leading to the suspension of Parliament. The Scottish parliamentary corporate body, the SPCB, has also formally requested that Police Scotland's protest liaison team and the Parliament's security team engage with This Is Rigged. The first interruption of FMQs came just before Douglas Ross had the chance to ask his first question for the new First Minister. Mr. Ross, who said the new First Minister was more divisive than Nicola Sturgeon, said less than 48 hours ago Humza Yousaf stood in this chamber and promised to be the First Minister for all of Scotland. Mr. Ross also questioned the First Minister over his creation of an independent secretary and the scrapping of ministerial posts relating to social security and tourism. In response, Mr. Yousaf stated that he makes no apology for the creation of an independent secretary, as we need independence now more than ever before. He went on to explain that social security is under the remit of the Cabinet Secretary for Social Justice and tourism is under the Small Business, Innovation and Trade. He not only faced First Minister's questions, but at Holyrood this afternoon, the Scottish Parliament approved the new Scottish Cabinet and ministerial teams proposed by First Minister Humza Yousaf. The new Cabinet and ministerial teams are Humza Yousaf as First Minister, the Minister for Drugs and Alcohol Policy, Eleanor Whittam, Minister for Independence, Jamie Hepburn, Minister for Cabinet and Parliamentary Business, George Adam, the Deputy First Minister and Cabinet Secretary for Finance is Shona Robertson, Minister for Community Wealth and Public Finance, Tom Arthur, Minister for Local Government Empowerment and Planning, Joe Fitzpatrick, the Cabinet Secretary for NHS Recovery, Health and Social Care is Michael Matheson, Minister for Public Health and Women's Health, Jenny Minto, Minister for Social Care, Mental Wellbeing and Sport, Mary Todd, Cabinet Secretary for Education and Skills, Jenny Gilruth, Minister for Children, Young People and Keeping the Promise, Natalie Donn, Minister for Higher and Further Education and Minister for Veterans is Graham Day. Cabinet Secretary for Net Zero and a Just Transition is Mary McCallan. Minister of Transport, Kevin Stewart. Cabinet Secretary for Wellbeing, Economy, Fair Work and Energy, Neil Gray. Minister for Small Business, Innovation and Trades, Richard Lockhead. Minister for Energy, Gillian Martin. Minister for Green Skills, Circular Economy and Biodiversity, who will work alongside the Cabinet Secretary for Net Zero and Just Transition, is Lorna Slater. Minister for Zero Carbon Building, Active Travel and Tenants' Rights, who will also work alongside the Cabinet Secretary for Social Justice, is Patrick Harvey. Cabinet Secretary for Rural Affairs, Land Reform and Islands, Mary Gorgon. Cabinet Secretary for Constitution, External Affairs and Culture is Angus Robertson. Minister for Culture, Europe and International Development is Christina McKelvey. Cabinet Secretary for Social Justice is Shirley Ann Somerville. Minister for Equalities, Migration and Refugees, Emma Roddick. Minister for Housing, Paul McLennan. Cabinet Secretary for Justice and Home Affairs, Angela Constance. Minister for Victims and Community Safety is Siobhan Brown. And moving south to the UK government, who announced energy plans in Westminster today. The plans claim to focus on delivering clean energy and building green industries in the UK. Among the plans was the announcement of the Great British Nuclear, which will initially be led by Simon Bowen as interim chair and Gwen Parry-Jones OBE as interim chief executive officer, with GBN's first job to launch a new competition to select the best small modular reactor technologies, one of the most advanced nuclear power technologies in the world, for development by autumn. Prime Minister Rishi Sunak said that Putin's weaponization of energy supplies is why the Conservatives are driving forward to boost renewables, revive nuclear, and build thriving industries like carbon capture, which will in turn create good jobs across the country, provide new opportunities for British businessmen at home and abroad, and maintain our world-leading action to reach net zero. Responding to Energy Secretary Grant Shapps' announcement today, SNP Westminster leader Stephen Flynn said this was trailed as Green Energy Day, but it feels more like Groundhog Day, with a complete lack of credible detail when the Acorn project will be given the green light to progress. You really are left to wonder what exactly the point was in this so-called announcement. Scotland is energy rich, and the reality is we don't need Westminster's assistance to move forward. We just need the power and the ability to make the decisions for ourselves. When that day comes, Scotland will export resources to our international partners, but until then, we will always be hindered by the millstone round our necks, which is the UK government. While the US and EU pump cash into green investment and carbon capture technologies, the Tories can't even get their act together on the long promised yet continually snubbed Scottish cluster. This plan is a mere drop in the ocean compared to what's required. Scotland is blessed with vast natural resources, and we have a real opportunity to harness the skills here to deliver a just transition, but what we need to move forward and what the UK government wants are two very different things, including their misguided, expensive focus on nuclear. With every false dawn and every set of warm words from Westminster, our industry is let down. Our green future is pushed back, and our country is failed. Small countries across the world are delivering now, and Scotland should be able to as well. Excuse me. The Scottish Greens called the energy plan ill thought out and said that it does not live up to the scale of crisis that we face. They have called for Downing Street to shelve its plans for new oil and gas exploration, as well as nuclear power. The Greens also argued that nuclear power is costly and will leave a toxic legacy, calling for assurances that the Scottish taxpayer will not pay for nuclear reactors across the UK when the Scottish government is opposed to nuclear power. The UK government has also announced a package of measures that it claims will turbocharge the UK's progress towards the decarbonisation of transport. They say that the measures will support the shift to electric vehicles, EVs, as well as the production of sustainable aviation fuel in the UK, continuing the country's transition towards net zero. The UK government has launched a £381 million local electric vehicle infrastructure fund alongside an additional $15 million for the on-street residential charging scheme. The UK government says that the funding will support the installation of tens of thousands of new chargers across the country, increasing EV infrastructure in every area and ensuring that the UK's charging network can support the increasing number of EV drivers and those considering the switch. The Conservative Party today has been found to have received £3.5 million from individuals and entities linked to climate denial, fossil fuels, and high pollution industries only last year, according to a new analysis. The website DSmog analysed Electoral Commission records, which shows that the party and its MPs received funds from the aviation and construction industries, mining and oil interests, and individuals linked to Global Warming Policy Foundation, a think tank that has denied the legitimacy of climate science. The analysis comes after the government announced an underwhelming suite of energy policies, which rely on carbon capture and storage, and which campaigners have said lack the ambition to properly phase out fossil fuels. Caroline Lucas, the Green MP for Brighton Pavilion, said the government's so-called Green Day couldn't be any more of a misnomer when the Conservative Party is raking in millions of pounds worth of dirty donations from fossil fuel interests and climate deniers. The Tories gained large sums from those with direct ties to fossil fuels, including more than £62,000 from Nova Venture Holdings, a firm wholly owned by Jack Tome, who describes himself as an energy investor on LinkedIn and lists his current role as the co-founder and director of Tailwind Energy, an oil and gas company. The party also received £10,000 from Alan Lusty, the CEO of Addy Group, a leading supplier of engineering services to the petrochemical industry, while Centrax, a firm that manufactures gas turbines, gave £35,000 to the party. The party received £23,900 from Ahmad Bissou, CEO of the oil and gas firm Onquest, who has argued that the North Sea could still yield further discoveries to extend its lifespan. The largest donor to the Conservative Party last year was the aviation entrepreneur Christopher Harborne, who gave £1.5 million. The entrepreneur is the CEO of a private jet company and also runs AML Global, an aviation fuel supplier operating in 1,200 locations across the globe with a distribution network that includes main and regional companies, according to its website. Harborne has previously provided gifts to Conservative MP Steve Baker, who co-founded the Net Zero Scrutiny Group and was once a GWPF trustee. Harborne has previously given $6.5 million to the Brexit Party, now the Reform Party, whose co-founder Nigel Farage has called for a referendum on the government's net zero targets. The entrepreneur has not publicly spoken out on the climate crisis. The largest single donation to the party, £973,000, came from Mark Bamford, who is a part of the JCB construction empire. According to the government's Environmental Audit Committee, the UK's built environment is responsible for 25% of the UK's greenhouse gas emissions, and there has been a lack of government impetus or policy levers to assess and reduce these emissions. The House of Commons Standard Committee has recommended a 30-day suspension for Rutherglen and Hamilton West MP Margaret Ferrier. The independent MP has damaged the reputation of Parliament and put the public at risk when she travelled by train after testing positive for COVID at the height of the pandemic. She is now facing a 30-day suspension from the House of Commons and the prospect of a by-election in her seat. If the recommended 30-day punishment is agreed by the vote in the Commons, it would automatically trigger a recall petition, opening up the potential of a by-election in the seat won by the SNP in 2019 and Labour in 2017. The length of suspension could also raise concerns among supporters of Boris Johnson, who is under investigation by the Privileges Committee for misleading Parliament over the Partygate scandal. The Standards Committee was split on Ferrier's sanction, with 3 of 4 Conservative MPs on the committee and the SNP member Alan Dorrans, plus lay members voting against the lengthy suspension. The Tory MP Alberto Costa, backed by Sir Bernard Jenkin and Sir Charles Walker, suggested reducing the sanction to 9 sitting days, which is under the recall threshold. There is a Tory majority on the Privileges Committee. Ferrier won a majority of 5,230 in the last election when she stood for the SNP, with Labour finishing second. She lost the SNP whip and has since pleaded guilty to breaching COVID rules and was sentenced to carry out 270 hours of community service. In September 2020, Feria developed symptoms and took a COVID test, but the next day she attended church and had lunch with family members. 2 days later, whilst awaiting the results of the COVID test, she travelled by train to London to take part in a Commons debate and ate in the members' tea room in Parliament. She then travelled home to Glasgow by train the next morning, a journey that takes up to 5 hours, despite being told that she had tested positive. First Minister Humza Yousaf said today that Miss Feria should step down so a by-election can be held. Moving internationally, at least 13 devotees were killed and more than a dozen people have been rescued after they fell into a well at a Hindu temple in India, officials have said. More than 25 worshippers plunged into a stepwell, a stair-lined communal water source, after the floor covering it collapsed on Thursday in the central city of Indore. Police recovered 11 bodies from the well and 2 people succumbed to their injuries at the hospital, said Nathuram Mishra, the Home Minister for Madhya Pradesh state. Mishra said an investigation had been launched into the tragedy and the families of the dead would be compensated. Police official Manish Kapira said rescue efforts were continuing and the injured people were moved to government hospitals for treatment. Television footage showed emergency workers using ropes and ladders to reach those trapped in the well. Other videos showed the caved-in floor and mangled steel bars and police using ropes to seal the areas. Temples across India on that day were brimming with devotees on the occasion of Ram Navami, a birthday to celebrate the Hindu deity Lord Ram. As mentioned in the Ukrainian war update, the Russian authorities have arrested a US journalist working in the country and accused him of espionage, a charge that could potentially carry a prison sentence of up to 20 years. Russian FSB security service said Evan Gershkovich, a well-respected reporter for the Wall Street Journal, was collecting classified information about the activities of one of the enterprises of Russian military-industrial complex. Gershkovich was detained on Wednesday during a reporting trip to the Ural city of Yekaterinburg. On Thursday, he appeared in a Lefortovo courthouse in Moscow for a brief hearing at which the charges were officially presented. The court ordered him to be held in pre-trial detention until at least the 29th of May, according to local media reports. The FSB claimed Gershkovich was acting on instructions from the American side. The 31-year-old journalist has lived in Moscow for 6 years, speaks fluent Russian, and is accredited as a journalist with the Russian Foreign Ministry. Prior to the Wall Street Journal, Gershkovich had worked in Russia for the Moscow Times and Agency France Presse. Before his arrest, Gershkovich was reportedly working on a story about Wagner, the notionally private military group run by businessman Yevgeny Prigozhin, which has done much of the fighting in Ukraine. Since Vladimir Putin, the Russian president, decided to launch a full-scale investigation of Ukraine last February, reporting from inside Russia has become much more difficult. Russian Foreign Ministry has put dozens of journalists on blacklists, barring them from entry and refused accreditation to others. Moving back to Scotland, up to £30 million will be made available through the Fuel Insecurity Fund next year to help households who are at risk of self-rationing or self-disconnecting their energy use, First Minister Humza Yousaf has announced. Sorry, excuse me. The funding will be made available to third sector organisations in the next financial year to support the most vulnerable households in Scotland. The Scottish Government had previously committed to doubling the Fuel Insecurity Fund from £10 million to £20 million. Previously, funding had been provided to third sector organisations, including the Fuel Bank Foundation, Advice Direct Scotland, and Scottish Federation of Housing Associations to provide direct support to households. First Minister Humza Yousaf said, "I have said my immediate priority is to do everything we can to protect every Scot as far as possible from the harm inflicted of the cost of living crisis. That is why, in one of my first acts as First Minister, I can confirm today that we will build on our commitment to double the Fuel Insecurity Fund from £10 million to £20 million, and to triple it to £30 million for 2023 to 24. In a country as energy-rich as Scotland, we should not have people living in fuel poverty. My government will renew and redouble our efforts to lift people out of poverty and make work fair and to make the economy work for the people." With energy bills still at historically high levels and the UK government's energy bills support scheme being withdrawn from the 1st of April over the next year, our Fuel Insecurity Fund will continue to be a vital lifeline for many households struggling in the country. Now, the controversial plans to build a massive holiday complex on the banks of Loch Lomond has become the most objected piece of planning in Scottish history. Flamingo Land's latest bid to rip out nature for hotels, lodges and a water park, and even a monorail, has amassed 65,000 objections so far, outstripping the number laid against their previous application, which held the record of shame until now. West of Scotland's Green MSP Ross Greer, who has led efforts against the proposal over the last 7 years, has said there can be no clearer sign for those considering this nature-wrecking application that the public do not want it in our national park. A record number of people, more than 60,000, who objected previously agree that this is the wrong plan for the wrong place and that it should be rejected at the earliest opportunity. The community at Balloch are overwhelmingly opposed to these plans, and I know how much they appreciate the support from across the country. Flamingo Land's owner promised that he would rip it up and move on if it was clear that the development was not wanted by the community. He should make good on that promise and walk away. If the sheer embarrassment of having the most unpopular planning application in Scottish history isn't enough, if the strength if the strength of the community against it isn't enough, if the weight of expert opinion from the likes of the Woodland Trust and National Trust for Scotland isn't enough to force Flamingo Land into walking away, then it is for the National Parks Board to do the right thing and reject their plans entirely. Well, that is it for this evening. That is it for this evening. Thank you everyone for bearing with me. Apologies for the snuffles and the coughs. I hope that they weren't too distracting. Before I go, I just wanted to remind you that at Broadcasting Scotland, we depend on the generosity of you, our viewers. So to everyone who has donated and to everyone who has signed up to make regular monthly payments, thank you so much. We appreciate you always. Our programmes will, of course, always be free to view. However, if you can afford £5 a month, please consider becoming a Broadcasting Scotland supporter. We've added ourselves a target of adding 10,000 new supporters to enable us to employ staff and to make more programmes. Good night. Thank you very much for watching. I've been Saoirse Healey.